All right, viewers, there's big breaking news coming in from Gaza. The deadline for humanitarian truce appears to have expired as of this minute. There has been no sign of an extension. Either Hamas, Israel, Qatar or any negotiators, they have not confirmed any extension, and firing, reports suggest, have begun. Israel says it intercepted rockets fired from Gaza towards its territory. The IDF says that Hamas had violated the agreement and fired missiles from Gaza towards Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces say it renewed fire against the terrorist organization Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, before the deadline had expired, rocket alerts were sounding in Israeli areas near the Gaza border, namely Sderot and Kibbutz Holet. In the 7 days that the truce lasted, 80 Israelis were released, primarily women and children, and some of whom are dual citizens. Another 24 foreign nationals were also released. 240 Palestinians had been freed from Israeli prisons, on the other hand, mainly women and minors. All right, to discuss matters further, we're being joined by Alan Burstein, who's the visiting assistant professor, Israel Institute Fellow, Department of Political Science, University of California, Irvine. Welcome to the broadcast, Mr. Burstein.
Thank you for having me.
Alan, now, we need to begin with this. Of course, there were some talks that there would be one more day of truce, and it was going day by day. If you just go by how it all started, it was a 4-day truce extended by 2 days, and in the last minute of the second day, there was a 1-day further extension. Now, of course, reports have come in that firing has started. It's definitely not a step forward in terms of resolving the matter. How do you see this going forward from here?
Well, resolving the matter means different things for both sides. As far as Hamas is concerned, they would love to have a truce that would lead to a permanent ceasefire. As far as they're concerned, that would be a victorious moment, despite the devastation that has happened in the Gaza Strip. If they manage to survive Israel's attack, it will be seen as a victory. In turn, for Israel, a ceasefire, any ceasefire that's beyond a truce to regain hostages, is seen as a failure. So for both sides, there's different interests in the truce. Israel's only interest really was in regaining as many hostages as it could. The minute Hamas started to indicate that it was not going to return as many hostages as Israel expected, it started already, as you said, 2 days ago, when the lists were not matching what Israel expected, and then half an hour before the truce expired, all of a sudden, they then did manage to meet the criteria, and then today, they did not hand over another list of 10 names. As far as Israel is concerned, there's no gain in continuing the truce, because victory for them, or resolving the matter for them, is pushing forward towards Hamas's destruction.
Mr. Burstein, stay with us. I'm just going to cut across to our other guest who's joining us at this hour. We're also being joined on News Point by Ms. Carolyn Glick, former foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Ms. Glick, now I also wanted to, come to you regarding this. Now, there were talks that Hamas wanted to extend the ceasefire ever since the beginning of the truce. Now, this report which has come in from the Israeli Defense Forces that Hamas violated the operational pause and in addition fired towards Israeli territory. What kind of a message is Hamas sending across here?
I mean, Hamas is sending the same message they've been sending all along, which is that they kill and they want to destroy the state of Israel. And then, they had basically exhausted their pool of hostages because apparently the rest of the women and children they've murdered. So the deal was for live hostages, and they had run out of them. And so that tells us more about the nature of the war crimes. We've learned a lot about that over the past 7 days of the ceasefire, with the hostages coming back and telling stories of starvation and torture. So that's one thing. But, Hamas and Israel, was clear that it was coming to an end. It was just a question of when, because Hamas has been violating the terms of the ceasefire all along, and using the time and the American insistence that Israel allow almost unlimited amounts of goods to come into Gaza through the so-called humanitarian resupply, that Hamas now is ready to go because they have all of the food, the medicines. They've been able to use the past week to regroup, to reorganize their forces, and so they're ready. The minute that they were ready, they ended the ceasefire. This is just sort of their normal operating procedure.
Mr. Bernstein, I would like to come back to you. Carolyn, stay with us. As far as the exchange was concerned, women and children, everybody understood that they would be exchanged for 3 prisoners from the Israel side. And now there were always talks that the exchange of the men and soldiers who are left, because very few women and children were left with Hamas. Now, as far as the men and soldiers, do you feel that has triggered Hamas to break the ceasefire, or do you feel there is something more here because till now the news was coming in that they are keen on ensuring that the truce continues?
So I think Hamas had an interest in this truce bleeding into another truce, and therefore they were going to try to extend truce after truce in order to lead to a situation that Israel didn't have the diplomatic capability to regain fire and start the invasion again in the Gaza Strip. In deals that were made, or negotiations that were made in Qatar yesterday between the head of the Mossad in Israel, the head of the CIA, the Egyptian Minister of Intelligence, and the Prime Minister of Qatar, the sides actually managed to come to some sort of agreement about the brackets of the different hostages that remain. So it was going to be men over the age of military service, then men in the age of military service, then female soldiers, then men or within the age of military service, and male soldiers, and then eventually bodies. And each one of these was going to have its own price, so to speak. Hamas, I think, would have been happy to continue negotiating and gain as much as they can for each one of these hostages. I think they recognize that Israel was not going to let them simply draw out the truce into another truce. So once they decided that they don't have enough people to return, or for whatever strategic reason they decided that to re-engage in fighting right now, likely they will try in the next coming days to say, we can again have a truce and you can get more hostages back. Now it's going to be a different price. They're going to demand a different price for each one of these brackets. The highest price that they're demanding is going to be for Israeli live male soldiers. That, as far as they're concerned, is the golden captures.
Ms. Click, I'll come back to you here. Now, as per reports, of course, it's too fresh to analyze it any further. As per the initial reports that have come in the hour just before the truce was set to end, Israel said that it intercepted a rocket. Now, the extended truce had not completely ended, and the rocket was already fired from Gaza towards Israel. What kind of a precedent is this setting for any kind of further talks for a temporary pause? Will it make it more difficult now that the truce has been ended in a rather abrupt manner?
I suppose so. Look, I mean, I think that the professor is correct in the sense that Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire, because a permanent ceasefire means that they get to come into Israel, slaughter 1,200 Israelis, conduct acts of mass rape, castration, etc., take 240 innocent Israelis to Gaza as hostages, torture them, and get away with it. So, of course, they want a ceasefire because that means they win. And the whole desire for a ceasefire is actually strategically means that whoever pushes for one is actually pushing for a Hamas victory over Israel. So Israel doesn't have an interest in that. Israel has an imperative to defeat Hamas. And I mean, we were in this ceasefire because they're holding our hostages, and we want to get them back. And so we stopped it in order to maximize the opportunity of getting our hostages back. We've gotten some 50 or so hostages back during this pause, and now we have to go back to fighting. Look, Israel has a difficulty inherent in its war goals, because we have 2 goals that are in conflict with one another to a certain degree operationally. One is rescuing the hostages, and the other one is destroying Hamas while Hamas is holding the hostages. So the pause was in order to try to get the maximum benefit from what Hamas was offering, and then go back and hit them hard. I don't think anybody is under any delusions about the state of most of the hostages, particularly the men who are remaining there and the women soldiers who are there. We already know what's happened to 3 of them. One of them we were able to rescue. One of them was brutally murdered, and the third one we saw on October 7th had been brutally raped, and we can only imagine her state now. But they have 7 female soldiers and they have several dozen male soldiers. So They may want to exact a price, but it's not quite clear what they have to offer at this point.
Mr. Burstein, I'll come back to you here now. Anthony Blinken was in Israel. Now, this was his third visit. Talk to us about how much of an influence US is even having here, because he came with a very clear agenda that they would want another day of the truce to last. Of course, that has not happened. Understandably, of course, the first firing, as per reports that have come in, was, the first step or in that direction was taken from Hamas. What kind of a role can any kind of foreign diplomacy have here when the two sides are, both sides? I mean, the entire matter is extremely volatile.
The U.S. has extreme pressure that it can mount on Israel, and it has extreme pressure that can mount on Qatar, hopefully to mount pressure onto Hamas. The United States has a lot of pressure on Israel, not only because of the aid that it provides Israel, but also because of the diplomatic umbrella that it gives. And one of the things that Anthony Blinken specifically said in his meetings with the war cabinet in Israel is he asked, how long is the war going to continue? And Israel's Minister of Defense said several months. And he said, if you do not minimize the number of Palestinian casualties, if you do not make sure that there's no Palestinian uprooting from the south of the Gaza Strip, you have weeks. You don't have months. That shows you the extent of the United States pressure, because he can say, this is the amount of time that we're going to be able to protect you diplomatically. So it has a lot of pressure on Israel, not so much to say Israel cannot retaliate right now to the rockets, but to say how it can retaliate or the extent to which it can retaliate, because it offers this diplomatic umbrella. In turn, it can also apply pressure on Qatar, which can apply a lot of pressure on Hamas. Say, Hamas has violated this now, but if you want the U.S. help to later facilitate, for example, mass release of Palestinian prisoners, or if you want the U.S. help to pressure Israel to possibly reinstate the Palestinian Authority or something like that, this is the pressure you now have to put on Hamas. So it has less direct pressure on Hamas, but it does have a lot of influence on how Israel at least carries out its activities, not whether it does or it does not, but how it carries out that activities. It does have a lot of pressure that it can mount on Israel.
Ms. Click, I'd like to take your opinion on the same matter when it comes to any kind of foreign diplomacy taking place here to have some kind of impact or some kind of pressure on the two sides to refrain. Of course, now who fires first is a question that can't be answered before time. But if there is any chance of a truce to be revived, how do you feel, or what kind of players do you feel would need to play a role here?
Well, I think that, again, a truce is not something that Israel is seeking, in the sense that we want to defeat Hamas. We can't continue to coexist with this genocidal jihadist organization at our doorstep after what they've done and shown that they're capable of doing and willing to do. I think that in terms of the international pressure, one of the things that's been disappointing about the Biden administration's position really has been that their demands for limits on Israel's military operations, actually, the gist of them is that the Biden administration is trying to prevent Israel from achieving our war aim of obliterating Hamas. And that's it's not just disappointing, it's really problematic, because it's not just that they have the UN Security Council veto hanging over Israel's head in a very nasty sort of way, because obviously the United States would never accept such limitations on its own operations against ISIS or against any foreign adversary. And we're talking about foreign adversaries thousands and thousands of miles from the United States. And here we're talking about a foreign adversary that invaded our territory that's sitting at our border. So this is a completely, it's unfair. Having said that, I think that what is becoming more and more evident to Israeli leaders, and we saw it in the reports of a very angry conversation between the War Cabinet and Secretary of State Blinken, is that the realization that we may not be able to rely on the United States as an ally, and we're just going to have to figure out a way to continue to prosecute the war, because as Defense Minister Gallant explained to Tony Blinken, we're going to have to do this with or without your support. And then what I found was interesting was that after this very sharp exchange between the defense minister and also the prime minister came into it, and Secretary Blinken, during that meeting yesterday that he held with the War Cabinet, the Americans very quickly said that they support Israel. So I think that there's a lot of argument inside of the Biden administration. There are a lot of very hostile, there are officials there that are extremely hostile to Israel, and there are officials there that are very supportive of Israel and understand how vital an Israeli victory is for American national security. So there's a split within the administration, and I think that after Blinken essentially represented the anti-Israel voices in the administration, then you had very strong statements of support for Israel coming out from the spokesman from the National Security Council, Jim Kirby, and from others in the administration, and even from Blinken himself. So I think the Americans are trying to test the limits of their pressure on Israel, and I think that they hit a wall yesterday at the War Cabinet in their exchange with Israeli leaders. Obviously, just on the issue of India, I think that India's support for Israel has also been very important because India is such an important power, and the fact that Prime Minister Modi has really, he's been very supportive of Israel, both in terms of international forums and also in terms of the actual exchanges that we've been having with the Indians during the course of the past 8 weeks, has also been exceedingly important to Israel, and I'm
Yes.
hoping very much and optimistic about the situation there, and
just
the
like
way that
to
India is also stepping up.
Yeah, I'd like to cut across to our other guest, Mr. Burstein. Here, I'd also like to reiterate India has made its stance regarding a two-state solution very clear. I'd like to come across to Professor Burstein here, who'd like to add to what you had said earlier. Professor, go ahead.
So the only thing I'd like to add is I disagree that Blinken is representing a anti-Israel stance. I think that we have to take into consideration that the United States has a lot more factors that it considers, among others, its own diplomatic stance and its own internal stance, and it's coming up in an election year in the United States. This doesn't justify how the United States operates or doesn't operate. But the expectation in Israel that the United States will simply back it no matter what is an expectation that I do agree with what Ms. Glick said, that Israel may be realizing that it cannot rely on that. At the same time, I don't think that we necessarily can characterize the Biden administration's stance towards Israel as a threatening stance with the veto in the United Nations. It has actually stood beside Israel throughout the entire time, and without that support, Israel, I don't think, would have any capability to actually carry on its war to whatever means it wants to achieve. It would not be able to do that.
Professor Burstein, thank you so much for joining in, and Caroline Glick also for joining in on the broadcast. You've both put your points across. It is definitely a very difficult time at least for the people who are right there in the region going through it. And here's hoping that some kind of a truce leading into a better resolution for peace can be achieved at the earliest. Thank you so much for joining in on the broadcast, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.